hearts hear and our lives respond. For he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. Boy, that seems like a relevant line right now, uh, doesn't it? You know, that the unbelievable divides that we see among us today, between political parties, between the haves and the have-nots, between skin colors, between faiths. It's a part of our human sin. We can't even recognize our own siblings. We can't see the image of God in each one of us, in each other. Whether it's walking down the streets or watching the news or what table we choose to sit at high school lunchtime, we love to notice our differences more than our similarities, and then turn that into the practice of division. Paul, or whoever wrote today's scriptures, because Ephesians, we're not 100% sure who wrote it, was trying to encourage unity among the Christians there in Ephesus, specifically between the new Christians who were Jewish and the ones who weren't, who came from the Greco-Roman culture around them. When we read these passages, it's hard sometimes to recognize how big of a deal this division was without being there and understanding the cultural differences that these two groups faced. It's hard to appreciate why they just couldn't get along. So Paul would write to them and encourage unity, and their message that message just never seems to grow old. If you've been watching the news over the past week, you probably heard that word unity a lot. It's a message that tends to get popular after a national tragedy we saw last Saturday, like what we saw last Saturday, even if it only lasts for a little while. This week, I got to go to Orlando for a conference about one of my favorite topics, justice. You've heard Ronnie and myself and others talk about faith, which it stands for fighting against injustice towards harmony, and an organization that fights for local social justice issues. And many of you met Josh, who was here a few weeks ago, and got to talk to him a little bit. He's an organizer with Faith. Faith is part of a larger network, and that network it's linked together by an organization called DART. Here, they love their acronyms, right? DART. It stands for Direct Action and Research Training. So the DART Center is the larger network that connects Faith with 31 smaller local organizations that are just like Faith, and they're spread across 10 different states. 14 of those organizations are in Florida. Faith is one of them. Many UCC churches across Florida are involved with their local DART organization. And when I became pastor here, that was the recommendation I got from a lot of my colleagues across Florida, is get involved with your local DART organization, because it's one of the best ways to organize for local justice issues, because it takes organization to develop the kind of power that's needed to convince public officials what's the right thing to do. And so I did. I decided that we were going to get involved with it. And when the opportunity came up for me to go and get some more training about DART, not to mention stay in a nice hotel and get to meet lots of people for a few days, I jumped at it. Although I have to admit that I saw quite a people get sick, and I said this earlier before church, saw quite a lot of people get sick throughout that 4-day conference. So I'm actually grateful that we're here on Zoom, so I'm not spreading any germs to you in case I'm carrying any home. But I did bring one very contagious bug home, and that bug is the justice bug. And I did bring that home. Trust me, it's highly contagious. And I promise you that if you start coming to any of the faith events, you will catch it too. Because it's really encouraging and inspiring to hear people talk about justice. I'm sorry to say there's no vaccination for the justice bug. There's no cure for it. Once you catch it, you just can't escape it. There are about 235 people there at this conference from as far away as Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, Alabama. It was really a cool sight to see. But as the week went on, I started looking even more closely and made some good observations. For one thing, there were a lot of people of color there. A lot. Maybe about 40% of the people at this meeting. And in case you haven't noticed, that's not a statistic that we share at our church. And that's something that I was grateful to be around. It's not just that. There were all denominations, from Catholic to Baptist to Salvation Army, and all have very different views of Scripture, of theology, and about worship styles. In fact, there were also lots of people from non-Christian faiths, such as Jewish people. I met some Jewish people. I believe there were some Muslim people there too that I just didn't come across. I didn't meet. But we do have people in our local faith organization, not just Muslim, but also Sikh and Jewish organizations in faith. So what a gift it is to be around so many people who think differently, worship differently, and believe differently. And all the while, I have had verse 14 from today's reading in my head. He has broken down the dividing wall, that is the hostility between us. In that room and in all the small group rooms that we shared with each other throughout the week, all of our differences were indeed put to death. Why? Because we all were there to share the focus of justice. And that shared belief, that shared value, made it impossible to ignore the call to unity. Fundamentalists, conservatives, progressives, Black, white, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Unitarian Universalists, women, men, LGBTQ+, yes, even Republicans and Democrats. We're all represented there. Any division you can think of was represented there, and we were all united. How? Why? Because we were uninterested in politics or racial or religious divide. We were there because we were invested in helping those who have no voices and who are the most vulnerable in our society. Because that's what God's mandate is, for us to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And that mandate transcends all those other barriers. But who are we to be united with? With the powerful or with the powerless? This week, all week, I've been reading, well, all week, I say, I don't get a lot of time to actually sit and read, but this book I've been reading, and it's by Reverend Dr. William Barber II, if you've ever heard of him. He's kind of a popular voice in advocacy these days, but it's called White Poverty. And really, it says, White Poverty, Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. And great book. And one of the premises of this book is that there's a myth about who we should actually be allied with. And that myth for white folks, very, very commonly, is that we have more in common with the rich and powerful people of the world than we do with poor people of color. And that's exactly what it is. It's a myth, and it's a lie. It's true that people who are Black are largely overrepresented as a percentage of the poor population. But the fact is, the majority of poor people are actually white. And those people experiencing poverty have much more in common with other people experiencing poverty of color than they do with people of power who happen to be their own race often. Remarkably, at one of the conference presentations, they started pulling up some of the same numbers that I had read in that book that week. And by the way, those same numbers go back for quite a time. And I remember studying them when I was in a social policy class 20 years ago at the University of Louisville. So of course, I'm going to share some of those numbers with you, which have gotten worse, not better, of course. Back in the 1960s, the US government created the Official Poverty Measure, or the OPM. This number was based on the price of food. And the OPM was calculated to be 3 times the amount that a person or a family of 4 could spend on food. So they based the poverty level on how much somebody would spend on their groceries, basically, times 3. At the time, that measure worked. It made sense because people spent about a third of their income on their groceries. That number has continued to fluctuate based on that standard by the cost of food. But of course, that doesn't work anymore because people now spend a much larger amount of their income on housing than they did back in the 60s. The current OPM, or the poverty line, basically, is what we call it, is $14,000 a year for a single person and $28,000 a year for a family of 4. So if you can imagine having a family of 4 and trying to live on $28,000, you know. So a single person would have to make less than $14,000 a year to be considered poor by the government. Anything more than that, and you're not poor. Isn't that a relief? Anything more than $14,000 a year. I'll wait for you to stop laughing before I move on from that. But I'll have you know that if you talk to a lot of people in our community who are experiencing homelessness, you'll find out that they get as much as $1,200 a month, which from Social Security income or from disability income. And if you get $1,200 a month, that actually puts you above the $14,000. So isn't it nice to know that many of the people experiencing homelessness in our town aren't poor? $14,000 a year. That works out to be $1,167 a month, rounded up, of course. Now, how much do you think the average rent is in New Smyrna Beach, Florida? Of course, you get different numbers for this depending on where you check it out, but a basic Google search told me that the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in New Smyrna Beach is somewhere around $1,350 a month, which works out to be $16,200 a year, and that's for a 1-bedroom apartment. So you have to be a couple $1,000s over the poverty line to be able to even just pay your rent. Not to mention food, transportation, utilities, healthcare, any of the other basic needs of life. Obviously, this number of $14,000 for a single person is not an accurate reflection of what it means to be poor. Some researchers have started using another value to determine poverty, and they've started asking this question. Can a person or a family afford a $400 emergency and still be able to pay their monthly expenses? So in other words, can they still pay their bills if they have one minor emergency? Say a broken down car, a minor problem in a broken down car, or an ER visit, like I had to go to the other day. It turns out, if you ask this question, 43% of Americans would not be able to afford a $400 emergency. Hear that. Almost half of the country, all colors, religions, and creeds, cannot afford to have one minor hiccup in their monthly expenses without facing the possibility of homelessness. So with whom do we stand united? In Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed." Well, is the information we just learned, is that good news for the poor? I would say it's not. That over 40% of our people cannot afford even one extra expense. That the government won't even consider them poor unless they are so destitute that they're beyond homelessness. That so many of us teeter on the edge of hunger and lack of shelter, and there's no relief in sight. That the local governments would rather spend our tax money on sports stadiums or tax cuts for businesses and new developments of McMansions that are out of everyone's price range than on housing for the people that live in our own community. That's unacceptable. And getting involved and making a stink about it is nothing more than using our prophetic voices to call out injustice. Martin Luther King Jr. said, if the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. If we make this mistake of confusing politics with justice and refusing to use our voices to speak up for the voiceless out of a fear of being impolite, then we are not the voice of Christ in our communities. If we have not allied ourselves with the poor, then we are not aligned ourselves with the gospel of Jesus Christ. You want to know the difference between politics and justice? Politics focuses on elected officials and their policies, but justice focuses on the people that those policies affect. Politics focuses on the powerful, but justice focuses on the powerless. As followers of Christ, we are not united by politics, even by creed, or by belief systems. We're united by justice. I got the chance to be reminded of that this week and to catch the justice bug. So come catch it with me. Let's follow Jesus to bring good news to the poor. Amen.